Hello my dear friends, you're in the Military Summary channel, and today we will discuss the situation in Ukraine on the 30th of March of 2025. Today we have lots of very interesting updates, so let's start. And despite the fact that the Russians are advancing along the entire line of combat contact, basically the Russians are breaking through the Ukrainian defense, the Ukrainian lines in the Sumi direction, in the South Donetsk direction, in the Kupyansk direction, so along the entire line of combat contact. Despite this fact, today is not a military day. Today is a diplomatic day where the sides, more precisely the Russians and the United States of America, are trying to find a formula, are trying to stop this war, are trying to stop this bloodshed, and many other things were discussed today between the representatives of the United States and the Russian Federation. And currently, and by the evening of the 30th of March, the President of Russian Federation, Vladimir Putin, made his own statements. So let's discuss everything in details, but first let's start from the beginning, because everything started yesterday in the evening of the 12th of March of 2025, and everything started with Putin visit. Russian President Vladimir Putin held a meeting on Wednesday at one of the command posts of the Kursk group, where he instructed to think about creating a security zone along the Russian-Ukrainian border. And this picture is the first shock that was faced by the European politicals, by the politicals from the Western side, because people from Europe, people from the United States of America, yesterday in the evening of the 12th of March of 2025, saw Putin in military uniform probably for the first time since 2021. So, and this is a very huge, very big signal to the Western countries that Russia is not going to stop, that Russia will continue its special military operation until the Russian Federation are able to get everything she was tasked at the beginning. So this is the situation. And during this meeting between the President of Russian Federation and the Chief of the General Staff of the Armed Forces of the Russian Federation, Valery Gerasimov, lots of questions were discussed. These guys were talking a lot about Kursk direction, about the Ukrainian losses, about casualties, about consequences, about everything. And the most important, once again, Putin asked Gerasimov to think how they can create the security zone along the Russian-Ukrainian border. So that was the first signal, and obviously the Western countries were shocked. But despite this signal, the Western countries, more precisely the President of the United States of America, Trump, said a US delegation was heading to Moscow to negotiate a ceasefire. And Trump, before everything started, hoped Russia would respond positively. Later we got the first video, and this is exactly the video we're talking about. The motorcade with flashing lights left Vnukovo 2 airport, where the US delegation's plan had landed earlier, a TASS correspondent reported. So this is exactly the delegation of the United States of America that left airport and was heading towards Putin, towards some central part of Moscow, with the purpose to start the negotiation process between the Russian and the US representatives. And later we got another signal. More precisely, the signal was sent by probably the representative, the special envoy from Putin, from the Russian Federation, Mr. Ushakov. And before the beginning of the negotiation process, and before the beginning of the negotiations between Putin and special envoy from the United States of America, he made lots of important statements. Basically, he made a temperature of upcoming negotiation process. Russia does not want a temporary ceasefire. It is interested in a long-term settlement, said Putin's envoy. Ushakov clarified that Walz called him yesterday and told him about the agreements with Kiev. Walz was told Russia's positions on the needs for a long-term settlement in Ukraine. The Russian presidential aide said that proposed temporary ceasefire in Ukraine is nothing more than a temporary respite for Ukrainian troops, just 30 days of rest. No one needs steps that imitate peaceful actions in Ukraine. The Americans understand that Ukraine's membership in NATO is out of the question in the context of a peaceful settlement, Ushakov said. There is a normal exchange of opinions in a calm manner between Russia and the United States of America. So a lot of very important statements were made by the representative special envoy from the Russian Federation, situation and summarizing everything, the Russia will never accept ceasefire, 30-day ceasefire, without some demands and without some important things, some details from the Russian side, which we will discuss in a minute. And during the 30th of March, there was another important meeting, another important talks on the territory of Moscow, and those were talks between the president of the Republic of Belarus, Alexander Lukashenko, and the president of Putin, Vladimir, and the president of Russia, Vladimir Putin. They were also talking a lot, and they were talking about the ceasefire, they were talking about a lot about different things, but we believe that Lukashenko came to Moscow almost at the same time when the special representatives of the United States of America came at the same time, probably with a reason. And it wasn't just a negotiation between Russia and Belarus. Most likely Russia wants to restore the Minsk process. If you remember, when talking about Ukraine and when talking about the conflict in Ukraine, there were three Minsk number 1, Minsk number 2, and now we believe that Russia wants to restore this process and to start another Minsk number 3 or Minsk number 4 or something like this. But we believe that this is the main reason why the president of Belarus came to Russia at the same time when the special representatives of the United States of America came at the same time. So we believe that this is exactly the situation. But according to information we have, there were no meeting between representatives of Belarus and the representatives of the United States of America. Anyway, after these talks, the Putin started giving his own statements regarding the situation with Ukraine, and they are very important. Let's discuss them in details. The situation in the Kursk region is under control of the Russian armed forces, and he is telling us completely the real truth without any lie. The Ukrainian armed forces are attempting to leave the Kursk region, basically the cauldron, in groups of 2-3 people. Russia agrees with proposals to cease hostilities, but insists that the ceasefire should lead to long-term peace and addresses the root causes of the crisis. As are we supposed to simply let the Ukrainian armed forces leave the Kursk region after all the crimes committed against civilians? This is the question that Vladimir Putin asked journalists. So if you remember, for the previous several days, we've been talking a lot about military crimes committed by the Ukrainians, and this is going to be one of the most important reasons and probably one of the important, let's say, paragraph, thing, and let's say situation that Putin is going to use against Zelensky and against Ukrainian regime. Moscow needs guarantees that during the 30-day ceasefire, Ukraine, the most important, will not conduct mobilization, one of the most important thing, train soldiers, or receive weapons. The Russian armed forces are advancing almost everywhere. It is unclear how the situation on the contact line will be resolved in the event of a ceasefire. Once again, Putin gave his own demands if the Western countries and the United States of America wants ceasefire. No mobilization, no training of soldiers, and no receiving of weapons. And this is exactly completely opposite thing that we can see right now from the territory of Ukraine, because today Zelensky and his team also made a lot of statements. For example, today the Ukrainians reported that Ukraine will continue mobilization even in the event of a 30-day ceasefire, said Kostenko, secretary of the Rada Committee on National Security, Defense and Intelligence. There is no talk of lifting martial law and ending mobilization. So as you can see, Ukrainians are not going to follow the statements and demands of Putin, which means that most likely this ceasefire will never happen. Now let's talk about this, let's say, area, about this territory, about Russian territory security zone. You know that Putin asked the Valery Gerasimov, the chief of the general staff, to think how to do this. You know that before the negotiation process between the Ukraine and Saudi Arabia that took place on the territory of Saudi Arabia between Ukraine and the United States of America, Zelensky had two trump cards. The first trump card was the territory that Ukrainians were controlling on the territory of Kursk Kursk region on the territory of Sudzha, but the Ukrainians lost these trump cards several days ago. And for example, today, according to the official statement of the Group of Forces North, the Russians managed to establish complete control over the Sudzha agglomeration, not just over the, let's say, city of Sudzha itself, but over the entire agglomeration. So as you can see, based on the official report of the Group of Forces North, we have colored the agglomeration completely in Russian favor. The Ukrainians currently control just several villages along the border, nothing more. So that was the first trump camp of Zelensky, but he lost this card. The second trump card of Zelensky was long-range drones. And right before the negotiation process, Ukrainians, if you remember, attacked deep inside of the territory of Russia, and they deal significant damage. But telling the truth, the Ukrainians were basically bombing and attacking mainly the civilian infrastructure, lots of buildings, parking places, lots of cars. So that was obviously something just to show as much as possible damage, as brighter as possible picture, nothing more. And the Russians reported that Ukrainians used the biggest number of drones ever, 337. So this is the second trump card of Zelensky. But the Russians have already found a solution how to remove this trump card from Zelensky as well. For these purposes, the Russians need just to do one thing. They need to create a buffer zone. They need to improve their positions along the entire line of combat contact and to take everything that is located, let's say, to the north and the northeast of this black line. We are talking about the northern part of Chernigov, Sumi, almost the entire Sumi region, of course, the Kharkiv direction. If the Russians are able to do this, then Zelensky will have nothing, no trump cards anymore in his hands. And then the Russians will not just demand, the Russians will decide how exactly the next ceasefire agreement or the truce agreement or the settlement agreement is going to look like. And obviously this is going to be completely in the Russian favor. So this is the situation. We are waiting for additional, of course, statements and so on. And of course, very interesting and very important to understand and to see the reaction and the statements of Trump, because obviously currently Trump is sitting in front of TV or in front of his laptop. He is listening Putin carefully, every single word. He's trying probably to check his reaction, the movements of his eyes and many other things to understand whether the president of Russian Federation is bluffing or he is saying the truth, and then he will make a decision what to do next. So obviously the next days are very important. So and now let's turn back to the line of combat contact, and as we discussed, as a result of offensive operation, the Russians managed to establish complete control over the city of Sudzha and the city agglomeration of Sudzha. We continue receiving updates and details of significant number of losses from the Ukrainian side. The Russians are flying on their drones along the main defense lines, supply lines, and we can calculate endless number of vehicles that were destroyed by the Russians as a result of FPV drone attacks. So this is the beginning probably or the end of this living road or death road. As you can see, hundreds of vehicles were destroyed by the Russians during this period of time. This is another video where the Ukrainians were trying to escape the Sudzha agglomeration, and here we can see tens of vehicles that were destroyed by the Russians. By the way, Valery Gerasimov yesterday in the evening reported that as a result of clashes, when talking about previous period of the special military operation, the Russians reported that 40% of losses among vehicles the Ukrainians suffered exactly in the Kursk direction. So 40%, almost half of vehicles that Ukrainians had, they lost exactly in this area, and 19% of servicemen. You know, that's another important thing happened today in the Sudzha direction, and this is probably something that Zelensky tries to use or to have as a third trump card. And we are talking about HIMARS strike that took place deep inside the territory of Russia, on the territory of the settlement by the name of Kozyrevka. So this is the video, and this is the consequences of HIMARS strike carried out by the Ukrainian forces. As you can see, significant damage, lots of losses, lots of damage and so on. And later the Russians commented the situation. For example, the Russians reported that this attack was carried out by United States of America, but the most important thing is that this attack was coordinated and prepared by French satellites. So probably Probably this is something like a test attack where the French and Ukrainians were trying to combine US weapon like HIMARS system, French satellites, and Ukrainian hands to carry out, to commit another, let's say, war crime, attacking civilians in this area. So, but this is a very important signal. This is very strong trump card that Zelensky tried to show Putin during this day, to show him that even if the United States of America are going to abandon us, we still have possibilities how to attack deep inside of your territory. Of course, not with the help of US, but French and France will always help Ukraine to fight with the Russians. So this is the situation. Another important thing is coming from the let's say Sumi Oblast. Today we got report that the Russians managed to improve their position significantly. Today the Ukrainian sources published the video how they were bombing and attacking the Russian units that were freely moving along the entire settlement under Ukraine fire, and this is 100% proof that the Russians control these territories. We have no doubts that the Russians have already begun creating their security zone in this area, but once again, we don't think that this is the primary area where the Russians are going to do this. We believe that the Russians first will try to cut this pocket, this salient between the Bryansk region and the Kursk region, because this is the perfect place to cut for the Russians and to reduce Ukrainian possibilities to attack deep inside of the territory of Russia with drones. Anyway, let's wait and see what is going to be next. Now let's move further. The Russians during the previous 24 hours continue bombing and attacking the Ukrainian positions here. The Ukrainians suffer significant losses. And as Putin stated, currently the Ukrainians are trying to find a way how to get a 30 days break, how to get a 30 days pause to restore their forces, to regroup in Sumi area, and to prepare themselves before possible offensive from the Russian side. And obviously the Russians are not going to do this in case if the Western countries will start supplying and supporting Ukraine. And you know that maybe the United States of America will accept this term, let's say these demands from the Russian side, but we understand that the European Union will never accept this. They will never accept, and they will continue supplying and supporting Ukraine with weapons. Now let's move further and let's discuss the situation in the Kupyansk direction, where the Russians continue their offensive operation. Today several sources confirmed that the Russians managed to improve their positions and to take the settlement of Boguslavka under complete control. The Russians intensified their activities recently, and this activities, this intensification of activities took place right after Valery Gerasimov visited this territory, where he got some reports and where he gave some orders. Furthermore, according to information we have, the Russians managed to improve their position significantly in the Leman direction. For example, this is the map by the end of the 12th of March, and this is the map by the end of the 30th of March. As you can see, the Russians managed to improve their positions. As for now, this information was provided us just by different mappers without videos that can confirm this. We have just one video from this territory where we can see 3 Russian soldiers that were freely moving on the village of Novolyubovka. This video was geolocated exactly in this point, and the Russians were moving from the settlement of Nevska to in the western direction. The video stopped in this point, but we believe that indeed the Russians were moving further in the western direction towards Ukrainian positions in this part of Liman direction. Now let's move further and let's discuss the situation in the Toretsk direction, where the Russians began stabilizing the situation. During the previous 24 hours, the Russian sources and the Ukrainians published lots of videos of how they were after withdrawing the Russians in this part of the city of Toretsk. I'll remind you that probably since the beginning of March, the Ukrainians carried out several successful counterattacks that allowed the Ukrainians to restore control at least over several parts of the city of Toretsk, including the northern part and the Zabalka micro-district. The Russians first were forced to fall back under the pressure of the armed forces of Ukraine, but now we start receiving more and more updates that the Russians managed to regroup themselves and they began counterattacks. And based on this video published by the Ukrainian side, we have adjusted the map in the northwestern part of the city. We have colored back the contested area in Russian favor. Now let's move further. As for the city of Pokrovsk, during the previous 24 hours, we haven't received anything special, just several videos that confirm the Russian positions in the area of Kotlina. As you can see, the Ukrainians continue their attack attacks on the Russian positions, which means that most likely the village of Kotlina is under complete Russian control, or maybe the Russians managed to restore control over this territory under another counterattack. So based on this video, we will adjust the map in the very near future. As for the South Donetsk direction, we haven't received almost anything from this territory. The Russians, after they managed to establish complete control over the settlement by the name of Dnieproenergia, stopped. They are not moving further. The Russians are trying probably to regroup themselves, or they're waiting the end or the results of the negotiation process that is currently taking place on the territory of Moscow. And we continue receiving very interesting updates from the Zaporizhia direction. Yesterday, if you remember, the Russians published lots of articles and published video how they managed to secure the settlement by the name of Pyatikhatki. In this video, we can see how a Russian soldier was raising their flag, the Russian flag in the most central part of the settlement. And now we start receiving updates that the Russians continue their offensive operation and that currently the Russians are attacking the settlement of Mali Sherbaki. So as for now, just several pro-Russian resources confirm this information, but maybe tomorrow we're going to start receiving first videos or some, let's say, reports from the Ministry of Defense, and then we will adjust the map. But obviously, this is very interesting situation. As for this attack, the main purpose of the Russians is to cut logistics between the settlement of Kamyansky and Orekhov, and then to handle with every single settlement separately. So the situation is very interesting, as you can see, and most likely we need to wait for lots of very important statements made by the Russians, by the Ukrainians, and by the United States of America. And that's it for today. Military Summary channel reminds we condemn any violence in the world. Thank you for watching. Subscribe to my channel, put your likes, join my Patreon, and have a good day. Bye bye.